Okay, so picture this. July 20th, 1969, the world's holding its breath, totally glued to those grainy images on TV, humanity taking its first steps on the moon. We've all seen the footage, heard those famous words, but there's always more to the story, right? And that's exactly what we're doing today, strapping in for a deep dive into the moon landing. We've got some stellar insights from the 10 Minutes of History podcast to guide us.
I'm ready when you are.
Perfect. And you know what? This episode really digs deep. It's not just the surface level stuff.
No, it takes you behind the scenes, really unraveling the whole context of how we even got to that one giant leap. It's fascinating.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. The podcast throws us right into the Cold War, which, honestly, when you think about it, the stakes couldn't have been higher. It was like a science fair where the grand prize was, well, the moon.
Exactly. The podcast nails it, emphasizing just how crucial it is to understand that global context. It's the 1960s, the U.S. and the Soviet Union locked in this intense rivalry and space. It became the ultimate stage for technological dominance.
Right. It wasn't just about exploring space itself.
Oh, absolutely not. It was about proving who had the right stuff, who was top dog.
And that's where Sputnik comes in. October 1957, the Soviet Union launches that little metal ball, the first artificial satellite. It was like someone fired the starting pistol.
And the shockwaves, they were felt around the world, especially in the U.S. The podcast really captures that, That Sputnik moment wasn't just, oh, look, something orbiting Earth. It exposed a potential vulnerability for the U.S., technologically speaking. And suddenly, the pressure was on.
Which is what leads us to Kennedy's famous speech, right? We choose to go to the moon. Those weren't just lofty words. They were a direct response to this new era, this space race.
100%. And the podcast drives that point home. Landing on the moon wasn't some whimsical goal anymore. It became this matter of national pride, this powerful symbol of American ingenuity and determination.
Okay, but think about the sheer audacity of the Apollo program for a second. I mean, to send humans to another celestial body and bring them back safely, that's next-level ambition.
Totally. It still blows my mind. The podcast does a fantastic job conveying just how massive this endeavor was. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people from all walks of life working together towards a single, seemingly impossible goal.
It really shows you what we're capable of when we work together.
It's a testament to human ingenuity, for sure. But like any great adventure, there's always another side to the story, right? A darker side. The podcast doesn't shy away from that. That's where the Apollo 1 fire comes in. A stark reminder that this quest for the stars, it wasn't without immense risk.
Right. January 1967, a routine pre-launch test turns into an unimaginable tragedy.
3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The podcast really captures the weight of that day, the somber reality. They don't sugarcoat it.
It must have been a devastating blow, not just for NASA, but for the entire program.
It was. But as the podcast highlights, out of that tragedy came a profound commitment to safety. I mean, NASA basically ripped up the rulebook, overhauled its safety protocols, redesigned aspects of the spacecraft itself.
So in a way, that tragedy helped pave the way for safer space travel and the missions that followed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They turned a devastating setback into a catalyst for progress, which, thinking about it, knowing the risks, the immense pressure, the mind-boggling complexity of this mission, did anyone really believe they could actually pull it off? I mean, really?
Yeah.
It's a good question, right? I mean, the odds were stacked against them. But there's something about that era, this unshakable belief in human ingenuity that really comes through in the podcast.
And it wasn't just NASA, right? The whole world was watching, holding its breath. The podcast really takes you back to July 69. It wasn't just an American story. It was a global phenomenon.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine that feeling, the anticipation as Apollo 11 launched. Millions, billions of people glued to their TVs, united by this shared experience, this massive achievement that transcended, any borders or ideologies.
It still gives me chills. And speaking of iconic moments, we can't forget those words. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Goosebumps every time.
Every single time. And you know what the podcast pointed out? We often think of those words as just like this spontaneous thing he said.
Yeah, like it just came to him right there on the moon.
Right. But no, apparently Armstrong, he actually chose them carefully. He knew the weight of the situation, that his words would be etched in history.
And they have been, haven't they? Become synonymous with human achievement, with pushing boundaries, with what we can accomplish when we set our minds to something.
Totally.
Yeah.
The podcast even goes into how those words have been analyzed, debated, reprinted a million times over the years. It speaks volumes about their power, how they captured the spirit of that moment.
It really is incredible. Such a simple statement, but it holds so much meaning. But of course, with any event this big, you're going to have some skeptics. The podcast even touches on the moon landing conspiracy theories, which you gotta admit are kind of fascinating in their own right.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it wouldn't be a global event without a healthy dose of conspiracy. The podcast dives into some of the more creative ones, like the whole thing being staged on a Hollywood soundstage.
Which the podcast debunks pretty
Oh,
thoroughly.
yeah. Complete nonsense.
Yeah.
But I do appreciate that they at least address it. It's a good reminder to think critically about what we see and hear, right?
R-
Especially when it comes to extraordinary claims.
Right. Question everything, even or maybe especially something as seemingly undeniable as the moon landing. But as amazing as it all was, the Apollo program, well, wasn't meant to last forever, was it? The podcast does a good job of capturing that bittersweet reality, how things eventually wound down.
It's true. As captivating as it was, the missions that followed Apollo 11, they faced a different landscape. You know, that initial high, that global euphoria, it started to fade a bit.
Yeah, the initial goal, the impossible one, it had been achieved. Plus, the Cold War was easing up, priorities were changing.
Exactly. The podcast highlights all of that. Budget cuts, the shifting political scene, public interest was still there, but it wasn't at that same fever pitch anymore.
It makes you wonder, are we as humans kind of hardwired to lose interest once that initial excitement wears off?
It's an interesting thought. Maybe there's some truth to that. But here's the thing. The story of lunar exploration, it doesn't end there. The podcast reminds us that we're actually seeing a resurgence of interest in the moon right now.
You're talking about the Artemis program. It does feel like space exploration is having a moment again, though it's a different landscape this time around.
Totally. Yeah, there are definitely parallels to the Apollo era, but the Artemis program, it's driven by a whole new set of goals, new challenges even, and honestly, a renewed sense of global competition too.
It's funny how history seems to repeat itself. We've gone from this race to the moon, fueled by Cold War tension, to a whole new era of lunar exploration.
And this time, the goals are even more ambitious. It's not just about visiting the moon anymore. It's about establishing a real human presence there.
Which leads us to that big question the podcast ends on. What would it actually take to live on the moon? It's mind-blowing to even consider.
Right. It sparks the imagination, doesn't it? But the challenges, I mean, they're astronomical.
That's one way to put it.
The podcast touches on a few. Creating a livable habitat, shielding ourselves from radiation, figuring out how to grow food in lunar soil.
These aren't just like engineering problems. We're talking about the fundamentals of survival.
Exactly. But it's amazing to think about the scientists and engineers who are tackling these challenges head on. They're basically writing the instruction manual for humanity's future in space.
And who knows what we'll find along the way, right? The moon might just be the first step. What about the resources hidden on asteroids? Or the possibility of life on other planets? We're at the very beginning of a whole new era of exploration and discovery. It's incredibly exciting.
The potential is limitless. And the best part, it's not just about, national pride this time or Cold War rivalries. It's something much bigger. This drive to push further, to unravel the mysteries of the universe, to find a future for humanity beyond Earth.
Now, that's a legacy worth striving for. It really is mind-blowing when you think about it, the idea of humans living and working on the moon, not just visiting, but actually calling it home. The podcast leaves us with this incredibly provocative image, a permanent lunar base. It's like something straight out of science fiction, but as you said, maybe not so far-fetched anymore.
And this is where things get really interesting. The podcast ends with this image of a lunar base, not just as an outpost, but as a stepping stone. Imagine a launch pad for missions further into the cosmos, a way station on the journey to Mars and beyond.
It's almost too much for my brain to process. But it also makes you think about the practical side of things. What would it take to actually build and sustain a lunar base? The challenges are enormous.
They are indeed. The podcast touches on some of them. We're talking about creating a completely self-sustaining environment in one of the most hostile environments we know of. Radiation shielding, reliable power sources, growing food in lunar soil. These aren't just engineering puzzles, they're questions of survival.
It makes you appreciate the dedication and ingenuity of the scientists and engineers who are tackling these challenges head on. It's like they're writing the instruction manual for humanity's future in space.
And they're doing it with the knowledge that every breakthrough, every hurdle overcome, brings us one step closer to making this science fiction dream a reality.
And who knows what we'll discover along the way. The moon is just one small step, right? What about the resources hidden on asteroids, the potential for life on other planets? It's like we're standing at the edge of a whole new era of exploration and discovery.
The potential is limitless. And this time, it's not just about national pride or Cold War rivalries, it's about something much bigger. It's about the inherent human desire to push boundaries, to unravel the mysteries of the universe, and to secure a future for humanity beyond the confines of Earth.
It's a pretty inspiring thought. So for our listeners who are feeling that spark of curiosity, that sense of wonder, what can they do to be a part of this next chapter in human exploration?
Stay curious. Engage with the wealth of information out there. Podcasts like 10 Minutes of History are a great starting point, but don't stop there. Read books, watch documentaries, follow the work of space agencies around the world, support organizations that are pushing the boundaries of space exploration.
Because this isn't just about sending rockets into space, it's about pushing the limits of human knowledge, ingenuity, and collaboration. It's a story that belongs to all of us.
And who knows, maybe one day we'll be talking about one of our listeners taking their first steps on Mars.
Now, that would be a deep dive for the ages. But for now, we've reached our destination for today. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey from the Cold War to the cosmos. Until next time, keep exploring.